Hello everyone, this is the Shientist, and I'm going to provide an overview of a link to one of the previous audios in this series on the molecular storm gauge, and that is a um, uh, kind of continuing of where the last audio podcast sort of left off from, and that is where we were talking, where the last audio podcast focused on research, science, and laboratory investigations. This particular podcast will focus on some further aspects around entity and a subject focus around sort of polypharmacy and nephrotoxicity. And before I begin, I want to highlight that um, uh, um, I have to say from the outset that the context and some of the understanding it is from the works of Dr. Shahid Nazir Mohammed, who has been an academic lead on behalf of the Renal Patient Support Group, so I'm sort of looking at looking at some of the work through the Renal Patient Support Group, or the RPSG, and sort of looking at the work around, in particular, the systematic review that was published in 2019, and looking at sort of the focus around polypharmacy and nephrotoxicity. Once again, for those who are listening, this is the Shientist, and this is an audio podcast in line with the third series on the molecular storm gauge, and this is looking at this focus will be around science and the healthcare multiverse, and this is another Storm Lobostics production. And um, uh, so where I want to sort of continue from is, as I've mentioned, a bit more around the polypharmacy and nephrotoxicity aspects, and I will break this down into sort of a bit of an intro or introduction, some understanding around aims and the aims and objectives, a look around a kind of an overview of polypharmacy and how that affects sort of kidney health, or and impact on kidney health practice. I won't go into too much detail about Dr. Shahid Nazir Mohammed's systematic review, because it is quite intricate in its own right. But just to highlight that, I do want to I won't be taking any of the credit for this. This is work just sort of highlighting some of the aspects of practice that that team has done in and around the kidney care space. And as you know, listeners, I'm well into sort of anything to do with long-term conditions, healthcare practices, healthcare service research, and also just generally healthcare research. So basically, then after the sort of aims and objectives, I will highlight some sort of salient points really around the different focuses or different entities of this subject entity in a bit more depth. We will look into a bit more where the last audio and podcast was did have a bit of a focus on the kinds of biomarkers to kind of look into detecting sort of ill health. I'll kind of touch on some of that as well, and then I'll highlight some aspects in relating to a bit of a sort of a discussion around the topic more in a more sort of bringing aspects of the work of this audio and podcast together, and then highlight a few sort of key main references and resources that listeners can check out in their own time. So with that all said, let's I'll begin with some intro on this. So science and the healthcare multiverse. I'm going to be talking a little bit about again generally aspects about healthcare or healthcare research and sort of the challenges around that, but looking at this from several several sort of perspectives, hence I guess you could say multiverse. So we know, for example, that multi-morbidity is rising, and or it has been rising, and with individuals experience potentially 4 or more sort of comorbidities at any one time, and at least 2/3 of the time, or 2/3 of the population, or where this is concerned, it's more prevalent if it can be can be highlighted through some of the evidences and literature that's out there, that it's 2/3 of the time is relating to population health is those beyond the age of 65 years old or years of age. And that's been documented in a NHS England 2019 report. It was I believe it was the long-term plan, or the long-term care plan, that was published by the long-term plan that was published by NHS England in 2019, and in that regard, because of the comorbidities, patients, whether we like it or not, in general population, and those in that age range or above, are potentially going to be going to have to be potentially prescribed certain medications, at least as far as I've seen in the literature, as well, that they would have to be sort of prescribe certain medications to offset some of the symptoms of particular comorbidities. And so over-prescribing certain medications sort of um, uh, uh, um, has to be sort of investigated and sort of explored more so than more so now than ever before, because that being said, the probability of developing certain irreversible conditions is part and parcel of the problem or the dilemma that healthcare professionals have to deal with, uh, and so when in that regard, for example, one irreversible condition, and again, having read the works around the renal patient support group, and I will use that example again, because they focus on that topic quite a lot, and they highlight that it's been highlighted that the kidney disease, for example, or renal disease is irreversible, and there's insufficiency, renal insufficiency, or where there can be a compromise to kidney health, for example, that can lead into chronic kidney disease. So and where that's concerned is not only is it irreversible, it's basically can be detrimental to other organs as well, because as listeners would know, one organ affected can impact other organs as well. So that being said, just a sort of a kind of a gentle reminder that with the physiology around the kidneys being compromised, for example, that can lead to inability for the kidneys to filter toxins and waste from the kidneys through urine, and urine generally is a sterile fluid, but obviously the insufficiency would then mean that if there's inability or incapacity to avoid urine, then basically the individuals then would just have insufficiency leading into damaged kidneys. So comorbidities generally have to be managed in some way or another, and this makes in some way, at least from again what I've looked at in the literature myself, is that it makes CKD a sort of a major public, it should be a major public health concern, and some data for you though, some stats for you, and that is that apparently CKD in England, in the UK, from at least 2009 to 2010, so some time ago now, was estimated at 1.44 to 1.45 billion pounds, and that was about 1.3% of the total NHS spending in that particular year, and those stats are and costings has been highlighted by the National Institute for Care Excellence in 2013, my nice 2013, and more than half of this was of that spending was actually spent on, or had been spent on, renal replacement therapy, or what is referred to as sort of treatment to to support renal function where there is insufficiency, where individuals have that renal insufficiency or insufficiency to the extent that there is a compromise to general renal kidney health, and also on that basis, that 2% of people, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the progression of the disease, of that long-term condition and illness was made apparent. I don't really like to get into the economics. It's quite overwhelming, but 7,000. But here's some just some I guess some baselines, incidences and prevalences. So in the from at least some basis of an economic perspective, roughly 7,000 strokes and 12,000 excess myocardial, what they call myocardial infarctions, occurred in chronic kidney disease individuals between 2009 to 2010. So basically, in that time, from at least from a sort of incidences and prevalences, and from I guess a baseline economic perspective, and where that money, where that funding has been used, at least around this particular condition, is basically to prevent and offset incidences and prevalences around strokes and sort of myocardial infarctions in those who had been diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. And I wanna sort of give a shout out to Dr. Mohammed on this, because basically he highlighted this in his paper publication, which was again published in 2019, this had and in that and so that was understanding that was data or perspectives that came out between 2009 to 2010, so just over a year. And this had an estimated health cost of 174 to 178 million pounds, and so strategies for disease detection and prevention were obviously had been used and had been used, and were and it was and in that time it was evident that it was needed, so or it was required. And so that being said, for example, conditions like where there's cardiovascular complications or cardiovascular disease, there's type 2 diabetes, there's hypertension, and other kinds of conditions. Those are all those particular comorbidities our focus is mainly in primary care or in community medicine, and the single most prevalent cause of disease and progression is or has been type 2 diabetes, and again, just to highlight that the focus has mainly been around those over 65 years old, 65 years of age, in that regard, according to the UK, a UK report referred to as what is referred to as I think is referred as the renal registry, I think there's a more newer edition, a newer edition now, or report, but this is some understanding I got from the 18th annual report, and it says that from 90 days to about by 90 days, that's 90 days, about 2/3 of patients in that time frame, during a sort of a set time, had hemodialysis, had to have renal replacement therapy, referred sort of known as hemodialysis, and one fifth had peritoneal dialysis, and 1/10 had peritoneal dialysis, as I understand it, and I'm sure listeners probably know more about it than I do. Had peritoneal dialysis, and they were which is another form of sort of renal replacement therapy or kidney replacement therapy, and 1/10 had sort of a renal transplant or kidney transplant that worked, and then a certain percentage had unfortunately passed away or stopped treatment. And that sort of understanding and data, if any listeners want to look into that, check out the renal registry report that was published in the 18th edition, was published in 2018 or 19, I believe. And again, I think there is a more newer edition, but you can check that out by putting in, for example, renal registry in your search engines. But then some of that context, some of the understanding, apart from Dr. Mohammed's paper publication, there is some other further readings on that, and that is by the nice paper, National Institute of Care Excellence in 2013, a paper by McIntyre in 2012, and much of the context around prevalences and some of the economic aspects, which kind of bores me to death, but it is out in the public domain. That's actually been published by Kerr and team in 2012, more context then around sort of polypharmacy is also has been highlighted in a paper by Foon in 2012. That's PHOON. And in addition, the population of the elderly over 85, for example, is projected to increase by 100%, and actually that shouldn't be any surprise really, because there is reports out there and some context out there to say, for example, I think it's in a King's Fund report, 2013 and 2018, I believe it is, that they have said that they want people should be not just living longer, but they should be living longer and living better, or healthier, and so there's no surprise that that should be the case, but at the same time, with if you think about it though, listeners, if there's basically those who have got who are for example over 65, and you have for example 2 or 3, maybe 4 comorbidities, then you're not really and truly, I don't know if I mean, I'm sure the majority in those population, or that those sort of age groups, are doing all they can to live healthier and do better in that context. I'm not gonna sort of slant that, but basically around that though, the question is then, what more can be, what more can they really do? I mean, if they're doing all they can to live healthier, despite having 3 or 4, maybe 5, maybe even up to 7 comorbidities, because it is possible to have, several comorbidities, and live healthier, and live well, and healthy. And by the way, healthy and living normal will have different connotations between one individual and another individual. So that's something to sort of wrap your heads around. So on this then, the population of the elderly of those living over 85 years old is projected to increase by 100%, as mentioned, and that's between 2012 to 2032, and we're in 2021 right now. And so if you go outside, for example, and you live, and this is just a random thing, maybe it's something that we could all do, is if you go outside one day and just look on the left and look off the right, look in front of you, maybe look behind you, and just get a rough inkling as to in your minds, really, sort of what age that these people are around you. And obviously, don't be so rude and just ask them. Even if you did ask them, people can be sensitive about their age, etc. But just have a rough idea, because that's the kind of thing we need to kind of get our grasp around. And so, that particular understanding and this focus has actually been published and highlighted by the National Statistics Office in 2014, and a paper actually by Jordan and team in 2013. The growing elderly care, and including care, the general health, just general healthcare, sort of industry as a general, and I'm going to say, irrespective of whether it's commercial, or whether it's sort of private entity, or it's sort of national health services, as part of those who as part of care, that point of care where everyone can get access to healthcare, which is free pretty much free at the point of care. Irrespective of that, if people are living longer, there is potentially more pressure on healthcare services and provision, sort of across different sort of elements and between health sectors. So there are obviously then this sort of kind of opens up the market for sort of things out there to companies, organizations to do whatever they do, to earn a living, etc. And that's that, again, that's not going to be the focus here, but what we sort of need to get our heads around, or I need to get my head around as well, is that with where at least aspects of where there's renal insufficiency and potential risk of nephrotoxicity from particular medications and polypharmacy and all the rest of it, sort of the question then should be, one question that should be encouraged again is, when is the right time in a way to screen for this particular long-term condition, and actually should there be more sort of point of care testing for other conditions, other comorbidities, to prevent them, if, for example, again, if it is a case that people should be living longer and living healthier. So I mean, what I'm getting at here, though, listeners, is basically that if we have people living longer, does that mean to say that even if they were to live healthier, does that mean they were still, would they, if they had 3 or 4, maybe 5, or 5 to 7 comorbidities or whatever, does that mean to say that they will actually still have I mean, are they to live longer to actually bring down from 7, maybe 5 to 7 comorbidities, down to 2 or 1? So that's a question that I'm just going to throw out there, and I'll leave that sort of open to your own thoughts to kind of ponder on. So now I'm going to go into sort of the kind of aims and objectives. And again, this is going to be sort of commenting on Dr. Mohammed's work on the renal patient support group, one of the academic leads for the the renal patient support group, or the RPSG. And in that work, the team kind of look at basically they delve into looking at polypharmacy and renal insufficiency, and trying to sort of appraise systematically if a polypharmacy actually has an influence on renal insufficiency in certain areas of population health. They ask the questions that they ask or explore really, should there be smarter ways to reduce the probability of polypharmacy occurring, and can sort of the certain the kinds of modalities can they that are implemented, can they help determine who could be who should be screened for renal insufficiency, if drugs or medications that patients might be prescribed to offset particular comorbidities, if they are toxic or become toxic and are overprescribed. And the third question that they ask is, are there any advantages or disadvantages of incorporating sort of collaborative efforts, across and in between healthcare sectors? So I won't delve into again too much about what polypharmacy is specifically. Suffice to say that it is, at least from what I sort of relaying what I said in the last audio and podcast, was to say that it is actually relating to where medication, apart from offsetting particular comorbidities and ill health, basically where patients or individuals can be prescribed 1 or 2 or between 2 to 5, or maybe between 5 and 7 different medications to offset different comorbidities, and thus all of those might be okay according to therapeutic doses, according to where preventing further ill health can be sort of abridged. But the issue is, in the long term, is would that not would that not cause more problems than actually solve, with regards to health? And would that not, more than likely, would that not actually sort of bring on symptoms of renal insufficiency or kidney insufficiency? So so going on from there, adverse events include at least where there's overprescribing, can cause sort of nephrotoxic side of effects affecting the functional components of the kidneys, and then in that regard, um, in that regard, um, uh, then there is uh, um, a likelihood or more higher probability, really, where patients, individuals might have increased, lengthier hospital admissions or readmissions, and uh, uh, and of course, such individuals may well be more greater at higher risk, or more probability, higher probability of the adverse effects of certain medicines that are cleared, that would normally be cleared from the renal organs, or kidney organs, and that some of that context actually has been highlighted in quite a few papers, but a really good one is actually by publication by Victel and team in 2007, and one team, at least from the works that I read, and Dr. Mohammed kind of summarized it quite well in his paper, around this subject, where they highlight one particular study and investigation that took place in Hong Kong, actually. So one team used a screening assessment program called SHARE in Hong Kong, and this was a population-based screening program targeted at defining the incidence in asymptomatic, and that means basically those who do not normally present with symptoms of unrecognized sort of kidney disease. And the program was implemented across several sort of population, several groups, or several different populations, and the team created surveys and around particular demographics to get history, to get health history, medical history of those who were recruited into particular studies, investigations, and along with consent to take blood pressure and do a sort of a urine dipstick measurements for protein, blood, and glucose. And this team, what they did, and what they highlighted, was that having a history of some of those comorbidities that I've mentioned in the before, in family, it can obviously cause problems, or can cause issues in health, over time, which isn't which should not be, which isn't a surprise, but those who have a history of these particular comorbidities actually at the same time can reduce by screening, for example, screening earlier, can reduce the likelihood of having urinary defects, and that paper again is there's a paper around the SHARE study in Hong Kong, and it was published in by a team called Lee and team in 2005. Quite an old study, but still the context around that is actually still has sort of readiness in today's aspects of today's health and population. In that context, though, care should be taken particularly where there is evidence of sort of nephrotoxic medication. One study informs, for example, there's these drugs called, for example, um, uh, diuretics, which listeners would know that what diuretics are about is basically, all about taking a piss. And then there's there's psycholeptics, which are other medications for I believe around areas of psychological particular episodes, or focuses that manifest in that way, and are most used in actually those who are, for example, in the age range I've said, so age range around between 65 to 85. Notwithstanding though, however, those in pediatrics and young people, there may be patients who are individuals on diuretics in that population, and there may be those on diuretics in the sort of the middle age population as well. So, but more about that can be actually identified in a paper by Dorks and teams in 2016, and but ultimately, much like I think how kidney disease or renal health sort of manifests itself, it kind of is silent and it's irreversible. It's really not it's not really talked about. It's not really understood in the public domain, though there is literature to say that in contrary. In relating to that, polypharmacy and actually areas of nephrotoxicity can also go unrecognized. So there is again Dr. Mohammed's paper in 2019 sort of highlight more around this context from a systematic perspective, and they use the team. What he does, or what the team do around that, is they use because of what literature highlights relating to how elderly are defined. As elderly care is really anyone over 65 years old, at least in how it's been documented in from a UK perspective. There's a paper publication by a framework publication that I did refer to in a previous audio podcast, and that was by it was developed by it was titled or referred to as Improving Care for Older People, and it was a sort of a national service framework document or publication and report, and so they used that team used that sort of document to actually refer to elderly care and also growing older people. There's another document that was published by Age UK 2017, titled Our Growing Older Population, and they also used a guidance relating to systematic review, which was it was documented in Dr. Mohammed's particular paper publication, so I won't go into that because it gets a bit intricate and quite detailed. But suffice to say, a part of the search strategy relating to how they identified the data and how they conducted the systematic review, they did this over a 21-year duration, when they were looking at literature dating back over 20 years, or just over 20 years. and they methodically implemented aspects of their search strategy, applying an appraisal skills appraisal program to actually identify different kinds of papers to identify and sort of screen and to get the appropriate literature focusing on the particular question that those questions that they were asking, as part of the aims and objectives that I read out earlier. So what they did was they do this by implementing an inclusion and exclusion criteria. They also put an aspect of evaluation, data extraction, and synthesis as part of their work, and also they look at guidelines, frameworks, policy reports, kind of were also I think they were they were included, and at least only where focus around renal insufficiency was included in those kinds of documentation, and not so much where polypharmacy and nephrotoxicity was concerned, because I think what they were trying to do, what Dr. Mohammed was trying to do, is try to implement and understand more focus around the sort of renal insufficiency. So guidance around that actually came from at least how it's documented in that paper, in that paper publication, was actually published by a sort of guidance was sought from there was a systematic review center for reviews and dissemination published in 2008, and there's a paper publication by Harrison and team in 2017 were sought to, and these were sought to reduce risk of bias, including non-randomized studies. So I'll just give an overview of these particular sort of what the data extraction and synthesis did, how they sort of got their got the number of paper publications following the number of after implementing sort of an appraisal skills appraisal skills program. I think they used. They based the team on what they did after they did that. They had were able to extract and synthesize really the appropriate number of papers, a number of reports according to different types of publication or outputs. So I'll just give an overview of this because I think it's quite interesting, and I'm not really. I'll be honest. When I've done in my own work, I've looked at focuses around sort of literature reviews and sort of narrative reviews and things like that. But systematic reviews and anything beyond that, it's mind-boggling. So I got quite interested into this because I'm trying to understand a bit more about how they did that. So from in at least where appraising and sort of critiquing certain kinds of reports and papers and publications, the extraction was that, and the synthesis effort was that in Dr. Mohammed's paper around this was that there was 1,506 papers that were identified via several across different databases apparently, and 1,491 papers where duplicates were evident, duplications of these particular papers were evident. They were removed, and then that actually brought down the number of papers to be scrutinized down to 44 and 44 were removed further from the 1,491, and then they were scrutinized, and any further duplicates were reduced and taken out, to get a bit more to add rigor, integrity, and relevance, according to four main focuses actually, and that included technology, polypharmacy, screening, and primary care. Though in all of those renal insufficiency had to be a focus in all of those. And I did mention, for example, polypharmacy wasn't polypharmacy and nephrotoxicity was part and parcel of the particular systematic review, and that what they did, I think what they tried, at least from the paper that I read, the main thing was renal insufficiency had to be the main thing across these particular themes. So again, those are technology, polypharmacy, screening, and primary care, respectively. And so records, guidelines, frameworks, policy reports that did not have that focus around renal insufficiency, but had a focus on long-term health, and for example, the NHS or National Health Service, they were further they were further excluded. So that actually meant that another 6 papers or 6 publications had to be taken out, and then full text articles and reports were further assessed for eligibility, and that actually took from there went down to another 32 papers were taken out, and full text articles were again they were omitted, where explanations were actually would have did not sort of fit the were not part of the that there was crossover across the different remit or something like that. So and what they were trying to identify from their original search strategy, and then after that, so that was another 9 papers, another 9 publications were taken out of there, and then full text articles and reports further scrutinized from what was from that number, and whatever that number was, and then 23 papers were included ultimately to actually that actually focused around the actual remit of the paper of the particular focus around what Dr. Mohammed was trying and the colleagues what their team was trying to do, and so 6 themes were derived from that, and I'm not going to delve into all of those particular themes, at least in their entirety, but what I was quite fascinated by with this particular work was to say that they used a systematic review process which involved a PRISM, that's not prison, by the way. It might feel like, I'm sure Dr. Mohammed felt like it was prison, but it wasn't prison. It was there's a schematic called PRISM, that's PRISM, M for mother, and that schematic was used to actually, or that diagram or schematic, I think, they used that to actually help summarize, evaluate, and extract and synthesize the actual literature that actually was absolutely relevant to the aims and objectives of their work. But they looked at, they had 6 themes, and those themes include, theme 1 was about renal insufficiency interventions in elderly care. Theme 2 was about they looked at, and I think I talked a little bit about this before, but I'll just highlight that they did look at aspects of polypharmacy detection on renal insufficiency, and a focus on costs. One thing that was quite intriguing, though, on that basis, is that technology assessment estimates the cost of medicinal waste, so medicines waste, sort of ranging from 6 million pounds to 12 million pounds per year, owing to polypharmacy. And Dr. Mohammed's work kind of highlights a little bit around that, so I won't go into that too much. But that's some some serious serious cash money that could be potentially invested in some other efforts. When I'm looking at when I looked at that particular work, I could it's and how Dr. Mohammed kind of highlights that in that systematic review, as I mentioned. It's quite a lot of medicinal waste relating to sort of polypharmacy, albeit though I got a sort of apart from what that paper sort of highlighted, it was actually the fact that whether something else could have been done with those medications. Like, so for example, if for example I don't know, certain medications might not be agreeable to some individuals or patients, and maybe medications are switched, and that meant that the older drugs that individuals or patients had, they would be thrown away or trashed or whatever. Then if for example in some aspects of healthcare, whole boxes or unused boxes of certain medications are thrown outrightly, and so isn't for example, if there's medicinal waste in that context, maybe perhaps those medicines could go to other somewhere else, where patients may have less risk of having any health complications, for example, and they may stand to benefit a bit more. Anyway, that's just some numbers that for you, for listeners out there. So that was under theme 2, and then theme 3, they looked at aspects of, I think, dose adjustments and medicines, and I think some aspects around medicines management. And then they looked at so that was theme 3, and then theme 4 was about sort of integrating and identifying renal insufficiency with a bit more sort of an educational perspective. And then there was theme 5, which looked at sort of biomarkers to detect sort of renal insufficiency or kidney insufficiency in aging population. And you'll remember, hopefully, listeners, that I did mention in the last podcast about research and laboratory investigations. For example, I mentioned a little bit about some of the biomarkers. I mentioned, for example, cystatin C, which is quite a good one. apparently, versus other biomarkers, but it's not in the mainstream. And if it was in the mainstream, it might have to be complemented. It might be more of a complementary biomarker than the main one, which is as I think listeners you would know now, hopefully, is creatinine, as a main biomarker to detect renal insufficiency. And by the way, there was a sixth a theme as well, and that is focused on sort of the healthcare professionals, and how they could be sort of more could make sort of the educational component more embossed as part of their their sort of continual professional development. So now I'm just gonna just highlight a bit more, or kind of bring together some of this context in a way of a sort of a discussion, really, and that is to say that long-term treatment or therapies that are in doses of I think it's in the literature out there, what's referred to as I think certain hypertensives can halt, not only just halt and prevent hypertension, but can also decrease what's referred to as hematocrit and proteinuria, so protein leaking into the blood, leaking from the kidneys or and the renal organs, when that shouldn't really happen, because protein, for example, albumin has a high sort of molecular weight, and generally speaking, it's one of the is for example, albumin generally, listeners, I'm sure you will probably be aware, to at least some extent, that is the biggest protein that makes that sort of is part of the way of our sort of across all of our proteins, and we shouldn't be leaking that. If there's evidence of albumin leaking, then that's where protein urea sort of is a problem, and in older people, this is where and actually younger people, which are a minority population when it comes to again, where I've read in some of the literature that they can have diagnoses of certain protein leaking type kidney diseases. And so so whilst that is the case, there was a study actually in again sort of in the 2005 period or duration, that highlights how resources can be sort of more more focused and rationalized to reduce aspects of nephrotoxicity or risk of nephrotoxicity, and again polypharmacy, and renal or kidney disease progression and cardiovascular risk could eventually improve, and this could translate into less demand for example, those therapies or therapeutics which relate to peritoneal dialysis or hemodialysis, which are forms of renal replacement therapy, and that's some understanding that's come out of a paper by Perico and team in 2005, and Nakamura actually did some work in around this focus in 2007, and prospective studies, as far as Dr. Mohammed highlights in his paper, in that paper about renal insufficiency and polypharmacy and nephrotoxicity. Prospective studies are needed or required to recognize how health, education, technology, and systems, or at least areas of health care and aspects of health education could be better integrated to support smarter and more informed decision making. And in line with that, potentially aspects of other areas of healthcare. Joined up, he highlights quite a lot. I think the guy's crazy personally, but he's done a lot in relating to the efforts around kidney care and kidney care practice. But basically, where he says joined up thinking and sort of integrating efforts between patients and professionals that could actually stand to, and I'll say this, kind of in one way or in one way or another, if there's more joined up efforts between patients and professionals, health professionals, maybe that can help save the world. And ultimately, bring together a link between, different multiverses. Anyway, then I'm going to say that just a little bit about what a sort of a conclusion on this. And again, this is kind of sort of context and paraphrase from that from Dr. Mohammed's work. And whilst renal insufficiency terminology closely interconnects to kidney injury, it is important to appreciate that CKD, or chronic kidney disease stage 2, is they highlight he highlights basically that is significant, but is sort of underreported, and he's saying that it's right to sort of highlight that service providers should continue really to view nephrotoxicity as an ongoing concern, and part of that is that the educational effort should be sort of person-centered or patient-centric in any population. That's what I'm going to say there. And then just to highlight, though, around at least some of the recommendations, and I'll use what they've said, what Dr. Mohammed says in his work, and that is to say that preventing unnecessary polypharmacy, implementing better ways to implement managing medicines and things, and over-prescribing in particularly, that could stand to help quite a lot of individuals in those age ranges between over 65 to up to 85 and older as well. So ultimately, by doing that, it's about strengthening sort of healthcare practices, identifying and screening out elderly at risk it should stand to be smarter, ensuring elderly are not overprescribed. Obviously, again, that would be pivotal, I would think. And treating comorbid conditions associated with renal insufficiency, nephrotoxicity, and sort of polypharmacy, including sort of symptoms of anemia. That's going to be important as well, and And finally, I think what they said in his work, and I would recommend checking out Dr. Mohammad's work, which was a systematic review. The paper highlights, what they highlight ultimately is that sort of where dose adjustments are required, education should be part of that, or educational support should be part of that, and there should be more efforts around that relating multidisciplinary team efforts and allied health professionals coming in where, for example, frontline healthcare professionals may not have that expertise, or not always have that expertise. So, and in that context, and a sort of group consultations, whether online or face-to-face, could stand to actually be advantageous, person-centric or patient-centric, and also there can be more robust healthcare plans, for patients, individuals who face sort of those dilemmas around aspects of their healthcare. So I'm going to leave it like that, and do check out some of those papers. Make sure you can check out Dr. Mohammad's work if you get time. That's and you can search out his work through the Renal Patient Support Group, the RPSG, and I believe again he's one of the academic leads for that for the Renal Patient Support Group, and there's quite a few publications on a research profile, which including notwithstanding the systematic review paper publication, but others as well. So I'm going to leave it like that, and I thank you for listening. I hope everyone has a good one, and I look forward to providing a bit more, hopefully the next audio around another important subject entity around healthcare, health service research, etc., etc. This has been an audio on the series on the molecular storm gauge, and this was around science and the healthcare multiverse. Hope you've enjoyed it, and it's been another Storm Logistics production. Thanks now.